The year 1833 marked a pivotal moment in British history. The British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. This legislation aimed to end the brutal system of slavery across most of the British Empire. For colonies like Jamaica, this act promised profound change. It signaled the beginning of the end for an economic and social order built upon the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of people. The act was set to come into effect on the 1st of August 1834, a date anticipated with both hope and trepidation by all inhabitants of the island, enslaved and enslaver alike. The passage of the act was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of decades of struggle. Abolitionists in Britain campaigned tirelessly. Enslaved people themselves resisted their bondage in countless ways, from open rebellions to everyday acts of defiance. These pressures mounted, making the continuation of slavery increasingly untenable, both morally and politically. The Act, therefore, was a complex piece of legislation. It reflected a compromise between the desire for emancipation and the powerful interests of the slave-owning class who dominated the colonial economies and held significant sway in London. For Jamaica, the largest and wealthiest of Britain's sugar colonies, the implications were immense. The island's economy was overwhelmingly dependent on enslaved African labor. This labor fueled the vast sugar plantations that generated enormous profits for British merchants and planters. The prospect of dismantling this system sent shockwaves through the colonial establishment. They feared economic ruin and social upheaval. For the enslaved population, numbering over 300,000 in Jamaica at the time, the Act represented a glimmer of freedom, though its full meaning was yet to unfold. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was a landmark piece of legislation. However, it did not grant immediate and full freedom to all enslaved people. Instead, it introduced a controversial system of apprenticeship. This transitional period was intended to manage the shift from slavery to freedom. It aimed to ensure a continued labor supply for the plantations. This decision, however, would soon prove to be deeply problematic. It demonstrated that the path from enslavement to genuine liberty would be fraught with new forms of control and exploitation for the formerly enslaved people of Jamaica. By the early 1830s, Jamaican society was rigidly structured around the institution of slavery. It had been a British colony for nearly 2 centuries. During this time, it had become the jewel in the crown of Britain's Caribbean empire. Its wealth was derived almost entirely from sugar cultivated by a vast enslaved workforce. The landscape was dominated by sprawling plantations. These plantations were owned by a small white planter class, many of whom were absentee landlords living in Britain. Their fortunes managed by overseers and attorneys on the island. This system was brutal and deeply entrenched. The number of enslaved people in Jamaica was staggering. On the eve of abolition, it is estimated that over 300,000 individuals were held in bondage. This was a significant portion of the total of over 800,000 enslaved people across the entire British Empire. These individuals were legally considered property or chattel. They could be bought, sold, inherited, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty with little legal recourse. Their lives were dictated by the demands of the plantation economy. The entire social, economic, and political framework of Jamaica rested upon their unpaid, coerced labor. The economic reliance on slavery was almost total. Sugar was king in Jamaica. It generated immense wealth for Britain, funding industrial development and enriching a powerful elite. Other crops like coffee and pimento were also cultivated using enslaved labor, but sugar dominated. The system was designed for maximum extraction of profit, with little regard for the human cost. The enslaved were worked relentlessly, often from sunrise to sunset, and sometimes through the night during the demanding harvest season. This relentless drive for profit shaped every aspect of life on the island. This deep-rooted dependence on slave labor meant that the planter class viewed the prospect of abolition with extreme hostility. They argued that emancipation would lead to economic collapse and social chaos. They had invested heavily in enslaved people, viewing them as essential capital. Their political influence in Britain was considerable, and they fought hard to protect their interests. The society they had built was one of extreme inequality. A tiny minority held all the power and wealth, while the vast majority endured a life of brutal exploitation, their humanity denied. The daily life of an enslaved person in Jamaica before 1834 was one of unremitting toil and harsh discipline. Most were forced to work on the sugar plantations, a physically demanding and dangerous occupation. The work involved clearing land, planting sugarcane, weeding the fields under the scorching Caribbean sun, and the grueling process of harvesting and processing the cane. This often meant long hours, typically from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. During the crop season, the work could extend late into the night as the sugar mills operated around the clock to process the harvested cane before it spoiled. Work conditions were appalling. The enslaved were driven by overseers and drivers who often used the threat and reality of brutal physical punishment to enforce labor quotas. Floggings with whips made of plaited cowhide were common for perceived infractions, such as not working fast enough or showing any sign of defiance. Malnutrition and disease were rampant, exacerbated by inadequate food rations, poor sanitation, and insufficient medical care. The enslaved were given basic provisions, often just enough to keep them alive and working, and were expected to cultivate their own small provision grounds in their limited spare time to supplement their diet. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological trauma of enslavement was immense. Families were constantly under threat of separation through sale. Enslaved individuals had no legal rights, no control over their own bodies or their children. Women were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation by white men on the plantations. Despite these horrific conditions, enslaved people found ways to resist. They developed rich cultural traditions, maintained family and community bonds where possible, and engaged in acts of resistance, ranging from slowing down work to escaping and forming maroon communities, and at times open revolt. The legal framework of slavery reinforced the planters' absolute power. Enslaved people could not own property, testify against a white person in court, or legally marry without their owner's permission. Their children were born into slavery, inheriting their mother's enslaved status. This system was designed to dehumanize and control, to extract maximum labor while providing minimum sustenance. The fear of rebellion was ever present for the white minority, leading to even harsher repressive measures. The Sam Sharp Rebellion in 1831–32, also known as the Baptist War, was a stark reminder of the deep desire for freedom and the brutal lengths to which the colonial authorities would go to suppress it. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 did not usher in immediate, unqualified freedom for the enslaved people of Jamaica. Instead, it implemented a system known as apprenticeship. This was presented as a transitional phase. It was meant to prepare both the former slaves and the planters for a society without slavery. However, for the vast majority of the newly emancipated individuals, apprenticeship felt like a cruel continuation of their bondage, albeit under a different name. It was a system designed to ensure the plantations did not suffer a sudden loss of their labor force. Under the terms of the Act, most formerly enslaved people were compelled to continue working for their former masters. This period of apprenticeship was initially set for 6 years for field workers, called predial apprentices, and 4 years for domestic workers, or non-predial apprentices. Children under the age of 6 on the 1st of August 1834 were the only group to be granted immediate and full freedom. All others above that age were bound to serve their former owners. This meant that families could be divided, with young children free, while their parents and older siblings remained in a state of coerced labor. The idea behind apprenticeship was ostensibly to teach the formerly enslaved the habits of free labor and responsible citizenship. In reality, it was largely a concession to the powerful planter class. They had lobbied intensely, fearing that immediate emancipation would lead to a collapse of the sugar industry if workers simply abandoned the estates. The apprenticeship system guaranteed them a continued, largely unpaid workforce for several more years. Apprentices were required to work for their former masters for up to 45 hours per week without wages. Any labor beyond these hours was supposed to be paid, but this was often disputed or avoided. The system was overseen by special magistrates. These officials were sent from Britain to adjudicate disputes between apprentices and their former masters. However, many of these magistrates were ill-equipped for the task or sympathetic to the planters. The planters, for their part, often sought to extract as much labor as possible during the apprenticeship period. They knew this system of near-free labor was temporary. The transition, therefore, was far from smooth. It was fraught with tension, resentment, and continued exploitation, falling far short of the true freedom that had been anticipated by those who had endured generations of slavery. Section 5. Life under apprenticeship, old chains, new name. For the nominally freed people of Jamaica, life under the apprenticeship system often felt like a bitter betrayal of the promise of emancipation. While they were no longer legally considered property, their daily lives remained largely unchanged in many respects. They were still tied to the same plantations, working for the same masters, and subjected to similar forms of coercion and control. The requirement to provide 45 hours of unpaid labor per week meant that, for the majority of their working time, their situation was indistinguishable from slavery. This naturally bred deep resentment and frustration among the apprentice population. Planters, determined to maintain their control and extract maximum profit, often exploited the apprenticeship system to its limits. They frequently disputed the hours worked, withheld wages for overtime, and continued to use harsh disciplinary measures, though the power to inflict punishment was officially transferred to the special magistrates. However, access to these magistrates was often difficult for apprentices, and their judgments did not always favor the workers. The old habits of domination died hard. Planters resisted any changes that threatened their authority or their access to cheap, compliant labor on the sugar estates. The conditions of work and life saw little improvement for many. Apprentices still faced arduous labor in the cane fields. Their housing, food rations, and access to medical care often remained as inadequate as they had been during slavery. The system created new points of conflict. Disputes arose over the definition of predial and non-predial status, which determined the length of apprenticeship. There were also arguments over the provision of food, clothing, and medical attention, which masters were still legally obliged to provide, but often neglected or reduced, claiming the apprentices were now partially responsible for themselves. Ultimately, the apprenticeship system proved to be unworkable and unsustainable. The widespread discontent among the apprentices, coupled with continued pressure from abolitionist groups in Britain who highlighted the system's abuses, led to its early termination. Instead of lasting until 1840 for field workers, full emancipation for all was brought forward. On the 1st of August 1838, the apprenticeship system was officially ended in Jamaica and other British Caribbean colonies. This date, rather than 1834, is often celebrated as the true moment of emancipation by the descendants of the enslaved, marking the end of this deeply flawed transitional period. Section 6. The price of property. Compensation for the enslavers. One of the most controversial aspects of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was the provision for compensating slave owners for the loss of their property. The British government allocated the enormous sum of £20 million for this purpose. This figure represented a staggering 40% of the government's total annual expenditure at the time. It was also equivalent to approximately 5% of Britain's gross domestic product, or GDP. This vast sum was not to be paid to the enslaved people for their generations of forced labor and suffering, but to those who had enslaved them. The justification for this compensation was that enslaved people were considered legal property under British law. Therefore, their emancipation was seen by the establishment as an expropriation of private property for which the owners were entitled to recompense. The £20 million was distributed amongst thousands of slave owners across the British Empire, including those with interests in Jamaica. The amount each claimant received depended on the number of enslaved individuals they owned and their assessed value. Detailed records were kept, meticulously cataloguing the enslaved men, women, and children as assets. The financing of this huge payout was a significant undertaking. The British government took out a massive loan to cover the cost. A syndicate of financiers, prominently featuring Nathan Mayer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore, underwrote the issuance of securities to raise £15 million of the required sum. The remaining £5 million was paid directly in government stock. This debt incurred to compensate slave owners was so substantial that it was only fully paid off by British taxpayers in the year 2015. This fact, brought to wider public attention in recent years, has highlighted the enduring financial legacy of slavery. In Jamaica, a significant portion of this compensation money flowed to absentee planters residing in Britain, as well as to merchants and financiers who held mortgages on plantations and enslaved people. These individuals, many of whom had never set foot in the Caribbean, profited immensely from the slave system and then again from its abolition. The scale of this compensation, when contrasted with the complete lack of any financial redress for the formerly enslaved, remains a stark illustration of the priorities and prevailing racial attitudes of the time. It underscored whose lives and losses were deemed valuable by the state. Section 7. An unsettled account, no reparation for the enslaved. While the British government generously compensated the enslavers for their loss of human property, the formerly enslaved people of Jamaica received nothing. There was no financial reparation for the centuries of unpaid labor, the brutality, the degradation, and the destruction of families and communities. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 and the subsequent policies focused entirely on the economic concerns of the planters and the imperial state. The immense human cost borne by the enslaved was systematically ignored in terms of material redress. This profound injustice laid the groundwork for persistent inequalities. The argument for compensating slave owners rested on the legal fiction that people could be property. The argument against compensating the enslaved or providing them with land or resources to start their new lives was largely unvoiced because their claims were not recognized. They were expected to transition from chattel slavery to free-wage labor with nothing more than the clothes on their backs and the limited possessions they might have accumulated. This immediately placed them at a severe disadvantage in negotiating fair wages and conditions with their former masters, who still controlled the land and the primary means of employment. The lack of any form of compensation or land distribution meant that the economic power structures established under slavery remained largely intact. The vast majority of fertile land in Jamaica stayed in the hands of the white planter class. Formerly enslaved people were often forced to continue working on the plantations for low wages or to rent land at high rates simply to survive. Some sought to establish independent free villages, pooling their meager resources to buy land where possible. But this was a difficult and arduous process, undertaken with no state support and often in the face of planter opposition. This failure to address the economic legacy of slavery at the point of emancipation has had long-lasting consequences. It contributed to the perpetuation of poverty and economic marginalization for generations of Afro-Jamaicans. The wealth extracted from their ancestors' forced labor had built fortunes in Britain and funded imperial expansion, yet they were denied any share of this wealth or any assistance to rebuild their lives. The call for reparatory justice, seeking to acknowledge and address this historic economic injustice, continues to resonate strongly in Jamaica and across the Caribbean today, a direct consequence of this unsettled account from 1833. Section 8. Economic Tremors Reshaping Jamaica's Landscape after 1834. The abolition of slavery, followed by the end of the apprenticeship system in 1838, triggered significant economic shifts in Jamaica. The plantation economy, which had revolved entirely around a captive and unpaid workforce, faced an unprecedented challenge. Planters who had long relied on coercion to secure labor now had to negotiate with a free workforce. Many formerly enslaved people were understandably reluctant to continue working on the hated sugar estates, especially under the harsh conditions and for the low wages typically offered. This led to immediate labor shortages in some areas. In response to these labor challenges, planters tried various strategies. Some attempted to enforce harsh labor contracts and low wages, leading to widespread discontent and strikes. Others sought alternative sources of labor, leading to schemes of indentured immigration from places like India, China, and Africa in the decades following full emancipation. These new workers often faced their own forms of exploitation. The sugar industry in Jamaica, while it continued, entered a period of decline, facing increased competition from other sugar-producing regions like Cuba and Brazil, where slavery persisted for longer, and from beet sugar produced in Europe. Many formerly enslaved people sought to create lives independent of the plantations. They moved away from the estates, establishing free villages, often on marginal lands in the hilly interior of the island. They focused on subsistence farming, cultivating their own provision grounds to feed their families and selling any surplus in local markets. This led to the growth of a significant peasant economy in Jamaica. This desire for autonomy and self-sufficiency was a powerful force reshaping the social and economic landscape. It represented a clear rejection of the plantation system that had defined their previous existence. The overall economic impact on Jamaica was complex. While sugar exports declined from their peak levels during slavery, the economy began to diversify slowly. New crops were cultivated and internal markets developed. However, the legacy of underdevelopment, rooted in centuries of exploitation, persisted. The lack of investment in education and infrastructure for the majority black population, coupled with the continued dominance of land ownership by a small elite, hindered broader economic progress. The transition from a slave-based economy was a long and difficult process, with profound implications for Jamaica's future development path. Section 9. Echoes in Time, the Enduring Legacy and Modern Reflections. The events of 1833 and the subsequent years of apprenticeship and emancipation cast a long shadow over Jamaican society and its relationship with Britain. The legacy of slavery is not merely a historical footnote, it is woven into the fabric of contemporary Jamaica, influencing its social structures, economic realities, and cultural identity. The compensation paid to slave owners, financed by a loan only settled by British taxpayers in 2015, stands as a stark reminder of where imperial priorities lay. The fact that this information was highlighted by an HM Treasury tweet in 2018, later deleted, brought renewed public attention to this uncomfortable truth. The lack of any compensation or reparatory justice for the enslaved and their descendants remains a deeply contentious issue. Historians like myself and Dr. Nicholas Draper from University College London's Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership continue to research and publicise the extent of Britain's involvement in slavery and its lasting financial and societal impacts. This work underscores the profound economic imbalance created by slavery, where wealth was extracted from the Caribbean and flowed to Britain, enriching individuals, companies and the nation itself while leaving a legacy of underdevelopment in former colonies like Jamaica. Today there are growing calls from Caribbean nations, including Jamaica, for reparatory justice from former colonial powers. These calls are not just for financial compensation but also for formal apologies, investment in education and healthcare, and the cancellation of debts. They seek to address the enduring harms of slavery and colonialism. The designation of August 1st as Emancipation Day, not only in Jamaica but also more recently in countries like Canada, designated on March 24, 2021, signifies a growing global acknowledgement of the importance of remembering this history and its ongoing consequences for communities around the world. The story of abolition in Jamaica in 1833 is therefore far from a closed chapter. It is a narrative of partial victories, profound injustices, and enduring struggles for true equality and recognition. Understanding this complex past is crucial for comprehending the present. The echoes of decisions made nearly 2 centuries ago continue to resonate, shaping contemporary debates about race, wealth, power, and responsibility on both sides of the Atlantic. The untold stories of those who endured slavery and fought for freedom continue to demand our attention and our commitment to a more just future.